Well, this morning we are going to enter a new territory. We're going to explore Leviticus 11 through 13, where a really important distinction is introduced that we'll try and spend some time thinking through. And the distinction is the distinction between clean and unclean. I think it's going to take a little while for us to get our heads around it because this is obviously a distinction that we really don't use today. That doesn't mean that it's unimportant. It's actually quite important. So let's see if we can kind of work our way into it, and then maybe some examples will help us to understand it. So the distinction between clean and unclean has to do essentially with this. The unclean is that which suggests defect, corruption, or death, and therefore cannot enter into the presence of God. Okay? That's essentially the category of the unclean. We'll see how this gets worked out in various ways. But anything unclean is that which suggests defect, corruption, or even death, and therefore it can't enter into the presence of God. Because remember what I said last week, the tabernacle, remember, is the one place in the whole world that's been restored to the purity of Eden. And you can't have death or corruption entering that because that suggests the sinful world that we live in. Okay? So Israel is going to have to live with these distinctions of clean and unclean. That which is unclean is not only not to enter into the tabernacle area, it's also to be excluded from the people of Israel, who are a holy people because, remember, they belong to God. So this distinction between clean and unclean is going to be really important. In 1531, I think we're given an insight into what the distinction looks like and what it means. This is what God tells Moses in Leviticus 15:31. He says, "Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst." So all the stuff that we're going to read about clean and unclean actually has to do with the fact that God literally is dwelling in the midst of the people of Israel. And therefore, they are not to admit uncleanness amongst themselves and certainly not into the tabernacle. Now, this idea of clean and unclean actually continues on into the New Testament. And I'll just say one word about it here just so that we can get maybe a sense of perspective. So in Matthew 15, Jesus enters into a debate with the Pharisees about the meaning of clean and unclean. And it's important to see what he says. That is, as he's debating them, he does not say, you know, all this stuff about clean and unclean, that's out of date. I don't want to hear anything about it. That's what they did back in the olden days. Forget it. Jesus criticizes the Pharisees not because they're making a distinction between the clean and the unclean, the pure and the impure. He criticizes them because he believes their understanding of purity is superficial and not deep enough. So what he ends up saying to them, and I'm not going to read it because we don't have time, but what Jesus ends up saying to them is, he says, look, you have a faulty understanding of purity because you're thinking about purity only in terms of what you don't do or people you don't associate with. That is, your understanding of purity is simply negative. So it'd be like me standing here saying, you know what? I'm an example of moral rectitude because I've never killed anyone, I've never stolen over $100,000, I've never falsified an election, and I've never robbed substantial sums of money from the church. Follow my example. Okay, that is, I'm defining virtue, right, only in terms of something that I haven't done. Jesus says that's inadequate. He goes on to say, well, actually what purity is, right? Purity is what you really desire. Jesus' purity has to do with what we desire deep down in the depths of our hearts. That's what purity is. That's what needs to be purified. Okay, so Jesus criticized the Pharisees for having a kind of superficial understanding of purity. So let's kind of work with this for a minute. We'll take a look at Leviticus 11, first of all. And here we have a distinction made between clean and unclean animals. I'll say a few words about this. We have a distinction between various kinds of animals that are clean and unclean. So land animals, fish, and then birds. Within those categories, and finally insects. We have distinction between clean and unclean land animals, clean and unclean sea creatures, clean and unclean birds, clean and unclean insects. Of course, as we all know, all insects are unclean, right? Especially roaches. But anyway, so what's the distinction between clean and unclean animals? Well, one thing, right, that's obviously going on here, as Leviticus 11 makes clear, is Israel is not to eat unclean things. This is the foundation of the whole notion of the kosher diet, right? So Israel is going to be distinguished from the people around her by a whole number of things. One of those is going to be diet, and so no unclean animals. So the question here is, well, what's the basis of the distinction between clean and unclean? And the answer is, we're not sure. So there are sort of two main schools of thought. I'll give them to you, and then we'll kind of move on to show how this works out. So one school of thought is this. One school of thought is the distinction in clean and unclean has to do with looking at the categories of animals and seeing that, animals in one category should have a certain number of characteristics. The unclean animals are the ones in a category that are missing one of the established characteristics. So let me give you an example. So shellfish are unclean, okay? And the idea seems to be, right, that the normative quality of things that live in the sea is they should have, as Leviticus says, fins and scales. Okay, that means that shellfish, right, are sort of the odd man out, therefore they're considered unclean. There's like a defect. That's the idea here. Another school of thought says that the idea between the difference in clean and unclean essentially is this, that in some animals, right, Israel is to eat certain animals that are actually sacred to various gods among surrounding peoples. And by eating animals sacred to certain gods, right, they're sort of denying the existence of those other gods. Okay, that's the idea. As I say, the debate between the rationale goes on, and we're probably not going to settle it this morning. But I think what we want to do is we want to understand the significance of the distinction. The purpose of outlining clean and unclean animals here, clean and unclean food, is in effect to kind of set or fence Israel off from the people around her. Okay? And that's essentially what's going to go on with most of the law or Torah. Torah functions in a way to kind of fence Israel off from the people that are around her. If we have time, I'm going to read to you a story about the lifting of that once we get to the New Testament. But I think that's a good place for us to kind of operate here at this moment. Now, one of the wrong ways of reading Leviticus 11 is, and this is kind of some modern commentators have decided that the real reason for the distinction between clean and unclean was essentially it's sort of hygienic. God was sort of like creating, the ideal diet for his people, disallowing certain animals. I think that's sort of like a modern kind of anachronistic way of reading Leviticus 11. I don't think that's at work here at all. It's ingenious. Some really creative minds have invested a huge amount of energy in pushing this. It has one defect, and that is it's probably wrong. Other than that, it's okay. Okay? So just clean and unclean animals here as the basis of Israel's diet. Now, in Leviticus 12, we get another kind of distinction between clean and unclean. It's the distinction about the uncleanliness that's associated with both childbirth and menstruation. So let me say a few words about that. This is obviously not a subject that is like, pleasant Sunday morning conversation, but it's here, so we have to deal with it anyway. So the idea here is that for a certain period during menstruation and a certain period after childbirth, women are considered to be unclean. It's a temporary uncleanness. So during this time, right, you would obviously not be going to the tabernacle, and you would not be out in society. You would be kind of withdrawn. I'll tell you a story about this in just a minute. Now, it's important to recognize here, this is a really important distinction, right? The distinction between clean and unclean does not translate completely into our distinction of moral and immoral. Okay? Obviously, there's nothing immoral about menstruation or childbirth because both have to do with something that God's actually commanded, right? Back in Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, right? So menstruation and childbirth play a role in fulfilling God's will, so they can't be immoral. So what's wrong with them? Well, probably something like this, right? Both these things involve the issue of blood, right? Both these things involve the issue of blood, and therefore they temporarily are suggestive of death, right? If you take a knife and slash your wrist, what's going to happen? Blood's going to start coming out, right? And if that goes on for a certain period of time, you'll die, right? So the idea here is that in this way of thinking, the issue of blood from the body suggests death, and therefore it's regarded as sort of a temporary uncleanness, both in terms of for tabernacle purposes, but also for social purposes as well. And once again, the idea here is the unclean has to do with that which suggests death or defect or corruption. Now, this is an important detail because at the end of Leviticus 12 and 12:8, we're told this is a purification offering for someone who's for a woman who's just had given birth. She says, and if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean. So there's at the end of this process, right, a sacrifice of atonement is made. That means now the woman's unclean. She can now go back in society and back to the tabernacle. I mention that because in Luke 2:21-24, this is precisely the sacrifice that Mary offers after she's given birth to Jesus, which tells us 2 things about her, noting Leviticus 12, right? A, this is the sacrifice that's provided for those who are poor. So we learn that important fact about Mary. And of course, the fact that she makes this sacrifice of purification, that helps us to see that she's a pious practicing Jew. This idea of purity and impurity means a whole lot to her. Now I want to read to you a story which I think can kind of maybe make this a little bit more accessible. It's a story that occurs in the Gospel of Mark. It's Mark 5:21-34. I think this kind of helps maybe make all this a little bit more manageable. And so here is the story. It's Mark 5:21-34. You'll recognize it right away. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. And then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. There it is, the discharge of blood for 12 years. And who had suffered much from many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. So here's this woman, right? She's had this issue of blood for 12 years. She has spent all her money on doctors. Does any of this sound familiar? and she hasn't been cured, and so she's come to Jesus. She heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garment, I shall be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving himself that power had gone out of him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And then, I'm not going to read this because of time, then Jesus goes to Jairus' house, and Jairus' daughter has died. So Jesus goes in, and he's now confronting a corpse. So notice what, this is a story about two unclean people. The woman with the issue of blood, and then the dead daughter, because corpses are unclean too, right? Notice what happens. Jesus restores both of them. Jesus restores both of them. By making the woman clean, right, she isn't just healed. She's now restored to the people of Israel and also restored to God. And by raising Jairus' daughter from the dead, right, she's no longer not only not unclean, she's also not dead. Okay, so we have an example, right, of God's healing power, right, in the case of both these people who were unclean and now they're restored to God. So a really important story. So once again, the idea here is we have a sort of human process, right, which suggests death or corruption. It means temporary uncleanness, and there's a period of waiting, and then a sacrifice for purification, and then one can return to normal life. Now, in Exodus 13, we have another kind of impurity, and that is the impurity that's associated with various sorts of skin diseases. I'll say something about that. I just want to note here, the ultimate rationale for purity comes at the end of chapter 11. It's Leviticus 11:44. So why is purity so important? Here it is. "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground, for I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." So, really important point. While all the stuff we're going to be talking about here might strike us as kind of odd and strange, insects and all these other sorts of things, don't let that get in the way of understanding the really important point. The people of Israel here are called to reflect the holiness of the God they worship. That hasn't changed in the new covenant. Okay, it's really important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, so it's really important to get that point. So in Leviticus 13, we have 7 different kinds of skin diseases or skin ailments that are described. The word leprosy is used, but it's being used here in a kind of a loose sense. It's being used as kind of like a all-encompassing category for all sorts of skin diseases. And once again, we have a whole process for determining, clean, unclean, and this is where Aaron's sons play a role. If there's any kind of, skin boils, scrapes, anything that looks odd or strange, the priests are to inspect that and determine uncleanliness and cleanliness. And along with this, we have a provision for if someone does have an unclean skin problem, here's what they're supposed to do. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. his dwelling shall be outside the camp, outside of where the rest of the people of Israel live. So it's sort of like a dramatic sort of display, right? Look, you, because you've got whatever, right? You are unclean, you suggest death, corruption, defilement. Therefore, you have to live apart from the rest of God's people outside of the camp. And if you walk around, you have to kind of walk around saying, hey everyone, I'm unclean. So everyone knows. So they don't come into contact with you, because if they come into contact with you, then that person becomes unclean as well. Now I want to read to you another story. This from Luke 5, which actually deals with the subject of leprosy, maybe once again to make this a little bit more concrete. So in this story, Jesus encounters a man who has leprosy. This is Luke 5, 12 through 16. While he was in one of the cities, there came a man, now get this, full of leprosy. He's full of leprosy. Okay, it's not a couple spots, it's like all over. And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and begged him. Now, listen to this very carefully. Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. Notice the man doesn't say, if you want to, you can heal me. He says, Lord, if you want to, you can make me clean. Notice what Jesus does. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him, and he charged him to tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing as Moses commanded, for a proof to them. But now even more, a report about him went abroad, and great crowds gathered around to hear him, and he healed them of their infirmities. But he withdrew to desolate places and to pray. So notice what happens in this story. Here we have a man who's unclean. He is therefore outside of the people of Israel. He's cast out because he's unclean. He's heard about Jesus and probably has kind of like been waiting like on the outskirts of town for him to appear. And then when Jesus does appear, he comes to him, falls down, and says, I believe that if you want to, you can restore me to God. I believe you have that ability. And Jesus, without thinking apparently, reaches out and touches him and says, be clean. And then we're told the leprosy immediately left him. Now, having Leviticus 13 as a background helps us to focus on what Luke wants us to see in this story. That is, Luke wants us to kind of think about two things here. And this relates to Jesus' identity. Thing number one, why is Jesus unafraid to touch someone who is unclean? What makes him have almost no scruples at all about touching someone who has leprosy? And thing number two, right? How is he able to render someone who's full of leprosy clean? And I think that what Luke is obviously wanting us to see here, right, is the answer to both questions is essentially the same. That is, here we have the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob present in person, who has the ability to overcome uncleanness and restore people to himself. So the story of Luke 5 kind of presupposes that we understand what's going on in in Leviticus 13. Now I want to read you another story from the New Testament, once again, that kind of draws on this distinction too, just to make the point that it hasn't just simply disappeared. This is Acts 10, 9 through 16. Let's see how we're doing on time. Oh, we got plenty of time. We don't have to be done till like 11:30 anyway, do we? Something's happening at 11:15. That's right. Okay. So here's a story from Acts 10, 9 through 16. Once again, I think you'll recognize it. So remember, Peter is been sent to the city of Joppa, and he's staying with someone. He's staying on the rooftop of someone's house, and here's the story here. Here's the most central part of the story. The next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up to the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw the heavens opened and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its 4 corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once into heaven. So, 2 things that are going on here that are really important. So, the rest of the story, of course, is that Peter is sent to the home of a Roman centurion who is a Gentile, buhis, unclean, right? And to his family. So no upstanding Jew, no Jew concerned with their own personal cleanliness, right, is ever going to enter a Gentile's house. But that's exactly where Peter's sent. And he preaches the gospel to Cornelius and his household, and they all accept the gospel. They receive the Holy Spirit and are baptized. And so this story is what takes place before this. So 2 things here, right? We're seeing that one of the things that's going on here in the New Covenant is this distinction between the clean and the unclean is now being revoked. For the reason, right, that God's people no longer need something to fence them off from the world, because God's people are now all over the world. Okay? So it's kind of an interesting vision, right? Because Peter sees all these animals, and God says, "Hey Peter, you're hungry. Here's a sort of a veritable meat lover's buffet." Okay, we've got steak and ribs and grilled chicken, and it's all yours. Go have at it. And Peter kind of like pulls back and says, "Oh, wait a minute, I've never eaten anything unclean, And that's when God says, "Look, don't call unclean what I've determined to be clean." That is, all people now are clean, right? Because they're all potential members of God's people because of the new mission of the church. And so Peter actually does go to Cornelius' house and preaches the gospel to him. We also learn here, right, that this happens 3 times, which suggests, right, Peter is something of a slow learner. It happens again, happens twice, happens a 3rd time, and Peter finally gets the point about what God wants to see happen here. One final thing that I want to mention too, by way of the New Testament. In Ephesians 5:27, we have this distinction between clean and unclean appear again, and it's short enough for me to read this, so it makes an important point. This is the point, right, where Paul is talking about Christ's relationship to the church, and he brings this distinction between clean and unclean in a kind of interesting way. So Ephesians 5:27. I'll kind of back this up a little bit so you get the full context. So, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by washing of water with the word, and here's verse 27, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. That the church might be cleansed and purified, so that the church actually might be brought into the presence of God, no longer barred from that by stain or blemishes or uncleanness. So now we have the distinction between clean and unclean gets radicalized, but it's still being used, right, to talk about God making people clean and acceptable to enter into his presence. Okay, what we're going to do is we are going to march into Leviticus 14 next week. We'll see how this distinction between clean and unclean continues to get played out. Just a kind of a note here before we go. Sometimes it's kind of helpful to kind of look at the way that books of the Bible are structured, because that kind of gives you clues as to what's going on. So a little note here about structure. So remember that in Leviticus 1 through 10, we're told important information about the tabernacle where God dwells. And then, as we'll see, in Leviticus 16, we're going to read about the Day of Atonement, in which a series of sacrifices are offered to cleanse Israel for all its sin for a whole year. So notice what we're doing here. All this stuff about clean and unclean occurs in between those two things, right? Tabernacle, Day of Atonement. What's being suggested here, and I think this is a really relevant point, Leviticus is trying to make the point that holiness is a matter that affects both how we live in God's presence, but also it affects how we live day to day. Holiness is not this wonderful kind of spiritual thing that we only save for like Sunday, when we put on our nice clean clothes and our nice fresh faces and we march into St. Peter's looking really nice and wonderful. Okay, but rather, holiness actually is something that's a matter of our daily lives. Between the tabernacle and between the Day of Atonement, holiness affects sort of all the details all the way in there. So we'll see how all that gets played out more next week. I think I'm being asked to get out of the way here, so I'm going to get out of the way.